Uh, an hour and a half, whatever you want. We don't have limited time.
That's a little long. Okay, I'll go an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. I guess it's after 10 o'clock here. What I'm going to do is we're having two sessions, and I'm going to speak on Rab Obadyá Yosef, the early years, and then the middle years. Aspects of his life, they're not really that well known. So let me begin, and you can type questions in, and I'll get to them at the end. Okay, so Rab Obadyá. I don't know if most of the people, if you look at the names, I see a good Sephardic element. So he's clearly very important, the most important sage in. For the Sephardim, I think probably could be since Maran Shulchan Aruch, or at least the Chida. So, but his early years are not as well known. Now, he's born in 1920, and he was named after his grandfather, who was, we're told, died al Kiddush Hashem, or at least one of his names was after him. The other name, Ovadia, is his father's name, and that's what they used to do in Iraq. You would take the name of your father, and then it would just continue like that. So it's funny, though, because Chacham Ovadyah's brothers, their names, their last name is Ovadyah, because that was the name of his father. But he didn't want to take that because it sounded strange. When they moved to Israel, they all took the last name of their father. But for him to be called Obadyá Yosef Ovadyah, that was strange, he thought. So he remained as Obadyá Yosef. The family moves to Jerusalem when he's 4 years old, so that'll be 1924. His father is not a great rabbi. We have stories, of all, great rabbis with children who are great rabbis. Chacham Ovadyah is significant in this respect because he does not come out of the rabbinic elites. Often there's this tradition, the father, son. He is not that. He comes from a regular family. His father is sometimes called Chacham, but and they say he knew how to learn Torah, but he's not a great Torah scholar like other figures of his day. And the family was not, I guess they're traditional. They're definitely not what we call Haredi. In fact, at least two of Chacham Ovadyah's brothers did not remain Shomer Shabbat, which I think is significant. Now, as with all great figures, he's described in his youth as being only interested in learning Torah, not in playing sports or games. And I think with him, you can believe it. We know that he also attended an Ashkenazi cheder in his youth, which is interesting. But unlike other Rabbanim, who you hear stories, all they want to do is learn Torah all day, and they're really not people persons. In English, we say people person. That is, they're not comfortable around people. They're comfortable around the books. That's not the case with Chacham Ovadyá Yosef. And one of the secret, perhaps, to his great popularity, the way he was able to create a revolution in Torah study, is precisely because he was a people person. He could speak to everyone, from the highest intellectual to really the man on the street. If you ever, I attended Shiur in Jerusalem. If you ever attended it, you know that he would have jokes and he would use slang. So he was very special in that respect. Light conversation. There's actually a video where you can see it on YouTube, where the Israeli soccer team comes to see him. And these people, they're so far from understanding the people on the soccer team. They come in jeans and T-shirts. They're going to meet the Gadol Hador. They don't even know how to dress properly. But you see how he's able to relate to them and talk to them, and gives everyone, his trademark little slap on the face. The other Rabbanim Gedolim, especially from the Ashkenazic world, they would have nothing to say. Talk to the soccer players, but as we shall see, Chacham Ovadyá Yosef, he always was a man of the people. Already at age 13 in Jerusalem, he's writing Talmudic Chidushim. And at age 14, he wrote Chidushim Navalei on the Sefer Echa. It's said that he wanted something to study, so he'd be able to study on Tisha B'Av, so he wrote it. He also became an expert in Dikduk, and his grandson tells us that he learned math. Why does he have to learn math? He has to learn math because there are certain tractates that if you don't understand math, you won't appreciate them. Other than this, other than the mathematics knowledge, As far as I know, Chacham Ovadyá had no secular education. He definitely did not have scientific knowledge. Okay, you can't have everything, but if you look at other Rabbanim, like Rosh Zalman Auerbach, who had scientific knowledge, you see the way he discusses electricity. Chacham Ovadyá, if there's one area, not for me to say, but if there's one area you might see something where is lacking, that's when it comes to scientific knowledge. In 1931, his father takes him to Baghdad when he's 11 years old. His father would go to business to Baghdad. And we're told even then that he impressed the sages of Baghdad. I only mention this because, as we shall see, Rab Obadyá Yosef would break with the Baghdadi sages, break with their tradition, 2 separate times in his life, and it created a very great controversy, as we shall see. Not this time, next time. Later, in 1931, he returns to Jerusalem. He enters the Porat Yosef Yeshiva. If you go to Israel today, as you walk down the steps in the old city, on the right, that big building is Yeshivat Porat Yosef. That's the yeshiva that was in the old city. Obviously, after 48, it could not be there. In 67, they return, and they establish a great yeshiva there. The yeshiva goes back to 1923. The money for this yeshiva, incidentally, comes from an Iraqi Jew who was living in Calcutta in India. In India, you had a whole Baghdadi community in various places in India. The yeshiva itself, Porat Yosef, followed the Pesakim, the rulings of the Ben Ish Chai to a large extent. And in fact, this was the only Sephardic yeshiva really in Jerusalem. And Chacham Ovadyá was much younger than the average student. He learned there, he studied there less than 3 months, we're told. His parents were afraid for him to go there. The Arabs, it was dangerous. Then he returned and he studied there a long time, from 1932 to 1947. So a real Talmud there. Basically, all the Sfaradi Gedolim, Gedolei Torah, come out of Porat Yosef Yeshiva. While he's there, he publishes his first booklet. It's called Yabia Omer. If you know Chacham Ovadyá, his Teshuvot are known as Yabia Omer, but he also published a little kuntras called Yabia Omer. It's not so substantive. He deals with it's tangential matters, dating of the sages, who's the teacher of one, this rabbi, that rabbi, and we also have a kinah he wrote at this time, after one of the Sephardic sages died. And it's amazing that every other word is a pasuk or a passage from the Talmud. If you want to see the kinah, well, we have a number of books of Chacham Ovadyá on him. This is a very interesting one. It's called Abir Haroim by his grandson. I guess this is what we would call hagiography, a traditional biography. We also have academic biographies. I'm sure some of you are from Syrian background listening. So, 2 of his teachers, Rav Yaakov Adas and Rav Zri Atiyah, were from Aleppo, not Iraqis. However, Chacham Ovadyá didn't just want the Sephardic approach. In the evenings, he would go study at Yeshivat Chevron. That's also in Jerusalem, in Geula. So he's well aware of the Ashkenazic method in study. In fact, we know from his grandson, we know from elsewhere, that he was not happy with the method of study in Porat Yosef, and his real learning was on his own. The grandson is very careful in what he says, and he doesn't reveal any names, but he tells us how in Porat Yosef, they could spend a whole 6 months and they would only do, let's say, 10 daf in Talmud. They did not cover much ground. They were not achieving greatness in learning. Chacham Ovadyá Yosef acknowledges that the Ashkenazi yeshivot are training Talmidei Chachamim better than Porat Yosef. In the Ashkenazi yeshivot, they combine what's known as bikiyut, that is, try to get much ground, cover a lot, and iyun, close analysis. But Porat Yosef, you could be there a whole year and maybe you do 15 pages. And how can you become a Torah scholar like that? So he tried to get them to change. They refused to change. And the Chacham Ovadyá Yosef did not feel that this yeshiva, although it is the most important of the Sephardic yeshivot, that it was properly training students. Look, what are they going to do? Are they going to acknowledge that the way they're studying was defective? But that's what he said. During the 1940s, Porat Yosef began offering instruction to students in English. Remember, the British controlled the land of Israel, and it was thought that it was important. And they also wanted to send Sephardic teachers out to minister. There were Sephardic communities, be it in India or in England, America, and they need to know English. Rab Obadyá Yosef, who later has a reputation, correctly, as very moderate, not an extremist. At this time in the 1940s, he protests and he organizes opposition to the study of English, both because it's bitul Torah. If you want to study English, fine, but if you're a yeshiva student, to study English is bitul Torah. And also, he was afraid, he had a concern. The yeshiva was paying teachers to teach Torah, English. And Rab Obadyá says that people donated money to the yeshiva. How can you use that money then for English instruction? The money was donated for Torah instruction. And he actually was victorious in getting the students to oppose this, and they dropped the plan. And his grandson tells us that this extremism was only for students in yeshiva. For those who were not students in yeshiva, he supported studying languages. But he also said it has to be religious teachers. I'll get to all the comments at the end. Now, Rab Obadyá Yosef became quite close during his time to another great Sephardic sage, Rav Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, the Rishon LeZion, the first Rishon LeZion in the state of Israel. And he would go study Kuzari with him. He would go to speak halacha with him. Other students at Porat Yosef would study Kuzari, but Rab Obadyá was not interested in philosophy, only halacha. He begins teaching when he's 17 years old, and he did this with the support of his teacher, of Ezra Atiyah. And these were classes for the masses. So already at 17 years old, he's giving shiurim to the balabatim, as we call them. And Rav Obadyá always had a good way of connecting with them. And this really explains some of his controversial statements in later years. I don't think we're going to get to it because the next class we're going to do the middle years. But after he resigned from the chief rabbinate, when he would give his shiurim on Saturday night, it got to the point where the newspapers would send reporters there because almost every class or every other class, he'd say something controversial. He'd curse out this politician or say something outrageous, the sort of things that hopefully in 100 years, no one will remember. They'll just remember the Torah. But I think often people didn't appreciate that when he spoke this way, he was speaking this way because at the end of the day, he comes from the street. He comes from not the upper crust. He comes from the lower level, I guess you would say. And he always had a connection to the masses. And when he gave these shiurim, he spoke to the masses in their language. And therefore, he would use slang expressions and he would speak to them. You know, he knew it entertained them. The problem was that Rab Obadyá he never could appreciate, I think, that anything he said that night would be sent all over the world, all the newspapers. He was speaking to them like he'd speak to them in the 1930s, when it's just, or 40s, when it's just him and the balabatim, and he can joke with them. But by the 1990s, 1980s, you couldn't do that anymore because an off-the-cuff comment cursing, let's say, Yossi Sarid or someone else would be placed in the newspaper. Now, this is when he starts to get his following. From age 17, giving shiurim to the balabatim. And precisely because he comes from that world. He's not one of the elite rabbi, from a rabbinic family. He grew up with these people. Therefore, he had a connection to them, and they were very attached to them because they too saw him as someone not from this rabbinic elite family, but someone who became a great Torah scholar, but came from them. So there was a great attachment both ways. And people began to ask him halacha questions. He's a young man, he's 17, 18 years old. They began to ask him questions. First of all, that's not normal to ask young rabbis questions that young. But they began to ask him questions, and he began to answer. And this is where already at 18 years old, controversy begins. Because Rav Obadyá was teaching classes using the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai is a sefer on halacha. Ashkenazim have the Mishnah Berurah, and the Sephardim, they have Kaf HaChaim, they have Ben Ish Chai, some other works, but Ben Ish Chai is a very important work. And for the Baghdadis, for Iraqis as a whole, the Ben Ish Chai is like the Shulchan Aruch. This is the final word in halacha for them. Furthermore, when the Ben Ish Chai differs from the Shulchan Aruch, they follow the Shulchan Aruch. That's their text. But Chacham Ovadyah, in giving his shiurim to the Iraqi community, understand this, these are Iraqi Jews who have come from Iraq, who for whom the Ben Ish Chai is the ultimate authority, and he's teaching these classes, he's reading the Ben Ish Chai, that's the shiur, he's reading it. But when the Ben Ish Chai differs from the Shulchan Aruch, Chacham Ovadyah is telling them, don't follow the Ben Ish Chai, follow the Shulchan Aruch. From his youth, he had this approach that now that we are living in the land of Israel, we have to follow the Shulchan Aruch. He said that Rav Yosef Karo is what they call the Mara Da'atra. He's the halachic authority in the land of Israel, and therefore, even though in Baghdad and Basra, we would follow the Ben Ish Chai, now that we are in Eretz Israel, we have to change our practices. And this would mean, for instance, that if in Baghdad, the woman would make a beracha on a mitzvah tasei mangrama, like on a lulav, here, no, she can't do that. This in Baghdad, the women would do like the Ashkenazim. They'd light the Shabbat candles, and then they would say the beracha. And Chacham Ovadyah said, here you have to change it. You have to follow the Shulchan Aruch. The women have to make the beracha, and then light the candles. This would become a very great controversy. It returns later, and it peaks in the 1950s when they wanted to put him in Chayrim. We will get to that, hopefully, a huge controversy. Now, Chacham Ovadyah wrote down, this isn't just something he did in his youth, he did this for 2 decades, and he wrote down his criticisms of the Ben Ish Chai, and he would publish them later in a sefer, a number of volumes, Sefarim, called Halichot Olam, and so he already in his youth is engaged in controversy. By the way, one of the people who was very opposed to him, not at this early stage, later, when the controversy again rose up, was none other than the Mekubal, the Rav Kaduri, and we'll come back to him. The real controversy, however, starts in the 50s, because now we just had a small group. Hopefully we'll get to the 1950s, and then you'll see, then it becomes a controversy that the entire community, the Iraqi community, is brought into, and all the rabbis, and that's where Chacham Ovadyah will leave the Iraqi community and go to the Torah community as a whole. When I say leave, I don't mean physically leave, but that's no longer who he views as the recipients of his Torah knowledge. Now, I have to say that for the most part, the Sephardic world did not have extremists. The Ashkenazi world has extremists. So, for instance, you have in the Ashkenazi world, all these yeshivot, they never accepted the chief rabbinate of Israel. That to them wasn't important. Many of them were anti-Zionists. In the Sephardic world, who ever heard of anyone who's an anti-Zionist? Everyone in the Sephardic world, be it in Morocco, in Syria, wherever you were, you wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael. You saw Eretz Yisrael as important. Who were the leading Torah scholars in the Sephardic world? It was the Rishon LeZion. The idea that you're going to oppose rabbis because of these matters, the Ashkenazim had that, not the Sephardim. But as with all generalities, there are exceptions. And there were some Sephardic extremists. And one of them, his name was Tzadka Hussein. And he's known and as a very pious person, but an extremist. And so, for instance, he spoke out against Rabbi Herzog, who was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. He wouldn't even call him rabbi. He called him doctor. Rabbi Herzog also had a doctorate. And Chacham Ovadyah, although he was quite young, he's only 23 years old at the time, he responds very harshly. And he says he will not teach Torah to anyone who criticizes Rav Herzog, and he says that Halavai, there at Tzadka Hussein, would come close to the level of Torah study of Rav Herzog. Rav Ovadyah was very close to Rav Herzog in that respect. So we see already early on this sort of moderation of Chacham Ovadyah. Okay, so 1947, Chacham Ovadyah has been studying at Porat Yosef, great Torah scholar, has a following, obviously speaks Arabic as his native language. Leaders of the Jewish community of Egypt come to Porat Yosef and they say, in Cairo, they say they need a rabbi. They need a rabbi. They have a chief rabbi, but the chief rabbi is more of a symbolic role, more of like a role intervening with the government, that sort of thing. They need a Talmid Chacham. They need someone to serve on the Beit Din. They need an expert in halacha to come to them. Now, the people in Egypt, maybe we have some Egyptians listening, were not very observant. The community structure, obviously the synagogues were what today we would call traditional synagogues, Orthodox, but most of the people were not observant. But the institutions, the synagogues were observant. So they needed rabbis who understood the people, first of all, could speak the language, and understood what it meant to be a rabbi of a community that most people were traditional, but not strictly halachic. Incidentally, you get a good sense of the times, what it was like to be in Egypt in those days. This is an era, by the way, where the well-educated Jews, they spoke French and they wanted to be very modernized. But I don't know if it's made it to Mexico, the book, The Man with the White Sharkskin Suit. That's a woman from Egypt who made her way to America, and she describes, Agnado was her name, as I recall, a wonderful book, growing up in Egypt. She claims in the book that her father had an affair with Kulthum, the most famous Egyptian singer ever. Rab Obadyá Yosef actually liked her music very much. Maybe I'll talk about that later, but the man in the white sharkskin suit, and you get a sense of what it was like in the final years of Egyptian Jewry, because not long after this, all the Jews basically have to leave. Now, as I said, you had many Jews who were westernized, French speakers. Many kids went to the Alliance, the French Alliance schools, or non-Jewish schools, and many were violating Shabbat. You didn't have day schools like you have in Mexico today, we have in America. Okay, so Rab Obadyá is invited to come to serve as Av Beit Din. And also, there was a yeshiva there called Ahava v'Achla. In Brooklyn, you have a synagogue, Ahava v'Achla, so that's like a continuation. There was a rabbi, his name was Shweki, Aaron Shweki, I guess that's a Aleppo name, and he came, and he's the one who came and asked Rav Uziel and Rav Zeratia to send them someone. And Rab Obadyá would also be the assistant to the chief rabbi. This Rabbi Shweki would come to America later, and then he went to Israel. Okay, so Rab Obadyá is chosen, and he agrees to leave Eretz Israel. And in 1947, he comes to Egypt. Clearly, big things are going to happen soon, with the war between Egypt and Israel. The chief rabbi, his name was Chaim Nachum, and he was quite old, so Rab Obadyá was chosen to serve in many roles. He would meet with government figures. There was a king then, King Farouk, and Rab Obadyá would meet with the king. He even met with him in 1948, shortly before the State of Israel was declared. But he refused to go. He still had strong ideas that even when pressure was put on him, he didn't do it. So, for instance, at that time, one of the consuls from one of the European countries died, and the funeral was in a church. And all the religious leaders were going, and the chief rabbi would go to things like that. And they told Rab Obadyá, you have to go to the church. And Rab Obadyá refuses. And he actually, in a teshuvah, in his sefer, Yabia Omer, he discusses this incident and explains why he would not go into a church, and you can't do that. I have to tell you, though, that the chief rabbis of England always went into churches. In fact, when King Charles is coronated, it's going to be in the church. And the chief rabbi goes to the church with the approval of the Beit Din, because the idea is that this is Shalom Malchut, that we have to have good relations. So they go. But Rab Obadyá did not go. And because he rejected what the chief rabbi asked him to do, and he disagreed with him in many other places, it created a big rift between Rab Obadyá and the chief rabbi. Now, this chief rabbi was not a Talmid Chacham, and there's some evidence that he wasn't even that religious. Throughout Rab Obadyá's writings, there's all sorts of negative comments about him. We're going to see one in just a few minutes. He was a political leader, basically. Not so, I'm not saying he was a Machal Shabbat, but he wasn't so observant. Rab Obadyá broke with him in other respects as well. The rule was that foreigners, if they wanted to get a get, they had to go first get a civil marriage, a civil divorce at their consulate. And there were cases where, for one reason or the other, the consulate refused to allow them to get a civil divorce. They had to go through certain procedures. And Chacham Ovadyah said, I don't care about that. What do I care if the French embassy is not going to give a civil divorce? And he would give gittin. When he came to Cairo, he saw there was a problem in the Beit Din system. The way the Beit Din worked was that we know that a Beit Din is three. There were two scholars, and these were not the greatest scholars, so these were like second-level scholars, and one lawyer recognized by the government. The problem was that the lawyer was not religious. So how can you have a Beit Din where you have two religious people and one person who's not religious? Chacham Ovadyah said, and even if they weren't religious, even if they were Shomer Shabbat, these lawyers, they were Amaratzim, they were ignoramuses in terms of Torah law. So you can't have that. So Chacham Ovadyah has a teshuvah on this. It's in Yabia Omer, volume 2, Choshen Mishpat number 1. And he states that this is unacceptable, and therefore from now on, there will be 4 people on the Beit Din. Well, who ever heard of 4 people on the Beit Din? Now, Beit Din's 3. Chacham Ovadyah says, no, from now on, our Beit Din will have 4. 3 dayanim and 1 lawyer. What this means is that the lawyer is just there for show. But the lawyer, you can't have a Beit Din where you have an irreligious person and one who doesn't know halakha on a Beit Din. Another problem he confronted dealt with conversions, in particular female conversions. Now, some of you are probably in the Syrian community, so conversions I understand are not accepted, but I assume you also know that there is such a thing as conversion. And even if your community doesn't accept it, conversion is part of Torah law. It's just that the Syrian community has a takana not to do it for important reason. But in Egypt, they did conversions. Now, we all know that for conversions, you need to go to mikvah. That's like the final step. You need to go to mikvah. And that creates a problem because we also know that the dayanim need to see the immersion. Well, how could the dayanim see the immersion of a woman? Obviously, that's not, there's no tzniut there. It's in... So the practice was in Egypt, he saw this when he got there, that the dayanim would stay outside and the woman would immerse, that is who's converting. And there were conversions, not of Arabs, but of Christians. Europeaners who were living there, they would meet, let's say, Jewish men, and they would be converted. So the woman would immerse in the mikveh in front of a woman. But that's not allowed. The dayanim need to see her immerse. So we're told that in the olden days, the mikvahs were so disgusting that they were like black. You know, the woman could be in the mikvah, the dayanim could come in and he wouldn't see anything. But thank heavens that the mikvahs today are not like that, or no one would go in them. But so what to do then? Chacham Ovadyah instituted, and this I think is now standard, that there be a cloth. You put across the whole mikvah this like blanket with a hole in the middle, and they would come in, they could see her head, and they could see her head go down and come up, and that's all you need to see. And he also suggested she could wear loose-fitting clothes. That's also acceptable. But so Chacham Ovadyah is coming and seeing that they weren't doing it properly. It was during his time in Egypt, I'll just mention about conversions, that Rav Chacham Ovadyah, because you had men converting also. Jewish women can be attractive to non-Jewish men. And Chacham Ovadyah, today you hear about conversions, they make it so difficult. Chacham Ovadyah believed in conversions. He believed that if the people are willing to be part of the Jewish community and in a general sense accept to be part of the community, to do the major mitzvot, that yes, we do welcome them. But you know, for a man to get Brit Milah, that's not so simple. Chacham Ovadyah concluded that you can not just use local anesthesia, you could even use anesthesia so that the convert is put to sleep, which makes it very easy. And you have that today. Many of the Russians who come, who are not circumcised, they will do that. And Chacham Ovadyah, they'll rely on Chacham Ovadyah that you can actually be asleep when you're given the Brit Milah. In Egypt, Rav Ovadyah, for the first time, was exposed to conversion for the sake of marriage, like I'm talking about now. Now, this is a problem because the Talmud says that you're not supposed to convert for the sake of marriage, but we have a teshuvah, a responsum of the Rambam. Maimonides, where he says that even though technically that's the law, the Bate Din in Egypt would convert the people anyway, because they said that better we go against this rule. So the Beit Din makes, sins, if you want to put it, in one small way, but we save this person from sinning for his entire life. You have a man who's with a non-Jewish woman or vice versa, and yes, the Talmud says not to, but today we see they're going to remain together anyway. It's not like in the days of the Talmud where if you don't convert, they won't marry. We know they're going to be married, and half the time they're already living together, they're civilly married. And you had this already in days of the Rambam, and cases like this, in particular with a man and a slave girl. That's the case we're talking about, to where he's with the slave girl and he's intimate with her, and he wants to convert her and marry her. And if they don't, he's going to continue to be with her. They say better to violate this restriction of the Talmud in order to make it easy for the man to be a Baal Teshuvah. And Rab Obadyá adopted this approach as well. As long as the man is not a Kohen, if he's involved with a non-Jewish woman, we try to convert the non-Jewish woman. Now, in the Syrian community, they concluded that if you say we're not going to convert these people, the tie of the community was so strong that the young Syrian men who became involved with these women, they're not going to intermarry and they're not going to leave the community, so it would work. It wouldn't have worked in Egypt, that approach. If you would not have converted these women, the men would have just married them civilly, or the men would have left the community. So Chacham Ovadyah went along with this approach of, now we're not dealing with the most religious people here. Remember, if we didn't convert them, they'd remain together. But Chacham Ovadyah felt that you don't need to investigate too much. As long as there isn't basically a guarantee that the person's not going to be observant. If the people say we're going to be religious, we accept them and we convert them. And then if it turns out the convert is not, it violates things, then that's a sinner. But the conversion stands. Kashrut was also a big problem in Cairo when Chacham Ovadyah arrives. Many of the shochtim were not reliable. And much of Chacham Ovadyah's time was spent improving the situation. This is not an easy thing because shochtim, they're usually like a union. And they don't take well when someone tells them they're not good. And there's all sorts of stories how they threatened Chacham Ovadyah, and it was not an easy situation. Even violence, or they threatened against him. He trained his own shochtim though, and from in the yeshiva, and he put pressure on the community to fire shochtim who are not reliable. But it isn't just that they weren't reliable. So, for instance, he discusses this in his Yabia Omer Volume 1 from 1948, Sivan. He tells us in Egypt, the practice was to shecht 3 times a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Well, what about if Yom Tov falls out on those days? Do you know that you can shecht on Yom Tov? You're allowed to shecht. And they used to shecht animals on Yom Tov, do shchita. But the problem was you have to, if you're a shochet and you shech the animal, you use it on Yom Tov. They started, or at least you have to eat some of it on Yom Tov. They started shechting for after Yom Tov, which is not correct. Furthermore, he tells us that people would come with money to the shochtim and buy the meats on Yom Tov. So he was able to stop the shchita. And we know that this, with one shochet, things got so bad that he hired non-Jews to attack Chacham Ovadyah. And he describes how they came, or his grandson describes, they came to the house and they started banging on the door. He wasn't there, his wife was there, but it's a problem because he was taking away their parnassah, but what can you do? If they're not reliable, if they're not religious, in fact, he describes one case where he found a shochet selling camel meat, if you can believe that. And from that point on, he required a mashgiach in the store. The old way, I know it might be hard for you guys to believe this, but the old way was that if the shochet was regarded as reliable, you didn't need a mashgiach. You didn't need someone coming in and checking the stores. Just like the old way was that if a person opened up a restaurant and this person is a religious Jew, You could eat there. Today, no one would eat in these places. Today, we need to have mashgichim and all that. But the old way was that we relied on this. Rab Obadyá also made sure that no, you could not be a shochet if you sent your kids to non-Jewish schools. Because if you're sending your kids to non-Jewish schools, basically you don't care about Torah. You have a Jewish school and you have a non-Jewish school, and you send your kids to the non-Jewish school. How can you be reliable if you don't care about your kids' education and you're willing to let them grow up with no Torah and assimilated? Then we're supposed to trust you that you're being a good shochet? Impossible. He improved religious life in other ways as well. When he got to Egypt, he found a superstition that women, after they gave birth, they wouldn't go to the mikveh until 40 days for a boy and 80 days for a girl. The Rambam already dealt with this practice. He calls it heretical practice. We don't know where it comes from. It's Karaites maybe or something else. He got rid of that practice. It's not so simple to get rid of a practice that people are doing, but he got rid of it. If you read Yabia Omer, you see all sorts of practices that either he got rid of or maybe he was able to defend it. So, for example, he found that in Egypt, people would sit for the Sheva Brachot at the chuppah. Now, I find this strange because in the Ashkenazic world, we all sit for the Sheva Brachot. I don't know in the Sephardic world at a wedding if you sit or not. Rab Obadyá Yosef says you have to stand. So maybe today you stand, but in those days they definitely were sitting. Another interesting minhag that he discusses, he comes to Egypt, and lo and behold, at the Beit Knesset, in a side room, you had a non-Jew, and they would call people up to get an aliyah, and everyone would make a pledge, money for the synagogue. Now, lo and behold, it happened that after Shabbat, when they come to collect the pledges, no one could remember what they pledged. The gabbai would say, you pledged $100. No, it was only $30, whatever. So they had a non-Jew, and the non-Jew would be in the other room writing down the pledge. Is this proper? Rab Obadyá rules, believe it or not, that this is okay. As long as you don't see the non-Jew writing it down, it's okay. For shuls that have this minhag. He says, don't start the minhag, but if you already have this minhag, you can. And according to the grandson in this book, Abir Haroim, which is published in 2012, this practice still continues today in Brooklyn at the Ava V'Achla synagogue, that a non-Jew records it. So quite interesting. He tells us, he writes in his Yabia Omer about all the Jews who had to work on Shabbat. They come to, they're in Egypt, and Saturday's a work day. And there would be early morning tefillah on Shabbat, let's say starting at 6 o'clock. And then the people would go to work. How are you supposed to judge these people? In Jerusalem, if you worked on the Shabbat, you're like a non-Jew, like a goy. But these are people who would go to the Beit Knesset. Friday night they'd go, they'd make kiddush. They wouldn't violate Shabbat. It's not like they would turn on the radio. And then they'd go to Shabbat in the morning, and then they go to work. But they went to work because they needed to support their family, not because they were rejecting halacha, or they felt they had to do this. So Rab Obadyá is very lenient on them. These are not people who are rejecting halacha. These are people who they're doing the wrong thing, but they feel they still respect the Shabbat. They're not shomer Shabbat. You could call them mechabed Shabbat or something. They respect the Shabbat, and it bothers them. They feel terrible that they have to do this, but they do it. And his answer, his solution was he encouraged them to go to Israel, and many of them did, because in Israel they could observe Shabbat. Maybe the most difficult problem that Rab Obadyá had to deal with in these early years was the Jewish hospital. And around this time, there's about 45,000 Jews living in Cairo. And with 45,000 Jews, understandably, they opened up a hospital. In 1907 already, they opened a hospital. It might be hard today to imagine this. Do you have a hospital in Mexico, a Jewish hospital? I don't know if you have a Jewish hospital. There's a Jewish hospital in Rome. You have a number in America. The hospital, the meat that is served in the hospital was not kosher. How that's possible, I don't know, but the meat was not kosher in the Jewish hospital. And the explanation given was that the hospital was in great debt and kosher meat was too expensive. Chacham Ovadyá comes to Cairo and he sees that the Jewish hospital is serving non-kosher meat. He couldn't understand this. He thought this was crazy. This is terrible because the Jews in Cairo ate kosher. These are Sephardic Jews. Ashkenazi Jews, they eat non-kosher. It's not a problem. They'll eat non-kosher meat. A Sephardic Jew, they eat kosher, even if they're not so religious, generally. And the patients who were at the hospital did not know they were being fed non-kosher. They kept it hidden from them. Talk about a scandal. Chacham Ovadyá says that even the chief rabbi would eat at the hospital. Now, I'm assuming it means he didn't eat the meat. He ate the other food. But still, this is not a kosher place. So you can't eat anything there because the kelim are not kosher. And Rab Obadyá gives this as an example of how this chief rabbi was not a real chief rabbi. As soon as Chacham Ovadyá finds out about this, he tries to fix the situation. Incidentally, even Chacham Ovadyá was very conscious of the fact that not everyone, there's difficulties. So, for instance, in his later years, he dealt with a question about a restaurant that's serving kosher meat. But after you have the meat, you want to have ice cream. It's all together, milk and meat together. They wouldn't serve it at the same time. But if you had your hamburger, your meat, afterwards you can have your cheese and all that. And Chacham Ovadyá says, not only can you give hashgacha to this place, you must give hashgacha. Because at the end of the day, what people do themselves, that's their business. But here, the food is kosher. And if you don't give a hashgacha, then the people will eat non-kosher. So look, the religious people will know that this is not the best place to eat. And so that is Rav Chacham Ovadyá Yosef's attitude, his whole life, to how we deal with the less religious. Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, the great rabbi who wrote the Tzitz Eliezer, he attacks Chacham Ovadyá's tshuva. He says, how can you say such a thing? That you can get dairy and meat in the same place, you give them hashgacha? And Chacham Ovadyá says, yes. Incidentally, there was a similar case in Mexico City, in your sports club. It's in the Igrot Moshe of Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was asked by Rabbi Hirschberg, who was the Ashkenazi rabbi. I don't know what they do today in the sports club, but in those days they wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to serve kosher. Could he give a hashgacha if they'd serve kosher meat, but then they'd also serve dairy stuff? And Rav Moshe Feinstein says, yes, you can. Okay, so Chacham Ovadyá finds out about this problem. And he tries to change it at the hospital. And he tries to do it quietly. Why he didn't make it public statement, I'm not sure. But if you read the biography from his grandson, you see that for 6 months, he didn't make a public issue. He tried, I guess he thought if he made a public issue, he wouldn't be able to change it. He told his students and he told everyone he knew, don't eat the meat there. And he tried privately to speak to the community leaders. The most he was able to achieve was that the community agreed to have a kosher section of the hospital, but they still continued serving non-kosher. And they said that they have no choice. They need the whole board. And so what did Chacham Ovadyá, after 6 months of not being able to change this, he told them that, he decided that he was going to resign. He announces one day that he's giving a special drasha at one of the big synagogues. So everyone comes, and at the synagogue, in front of everyone, there's a special drasha he's giving. They're curious what he's going to speak about. He announces, first of all, that no one can eat anything in the hospital, since it's not kosher. And he also says, if this is not fixed immediately, I am resigning. This is 1948, I believe. Now, Chacham Ovadyá expected them to immediately fix it because they needed him. He was the Abeitin. Anyone who wants to get a get or any conversion, he has to be in charge of it. Marriages also. At this time, they couldn't bring in another rabbi. They couldn't bring in anyone from Israel, and the government wasn't going to let them bring in any other rabbi. So he's the only real rabbi there. But the community leadership told him, and we have an expression in English, close the door on your way out. Or don't let the door hit you on the way out. They said, fine, we'll find someone else. Remember, there were other dayanim. They'll do it. He's too much trouble. And so Chacham Ovadyá is officially resigned. He would then keep his students, and he'd later go back to Israel. Let me give you some other examples. The Moel of Cairo. the only one who had government approval to do Brit Milah would drive his car on Shabbat to do the Brit. Because he'd get a call from someone during the week. They live on the other side of the city. How's he supposed to do Brit Milah? Well, in a case like that, according to halacha, we can't require the Moel to spend it away from his family, so they have to do the Brit Milah on Sunday. Better to do the Brit Milah on the 9th day than to be Machal Shabbat. And especially for a Moel, to be Machal Shabbat, the Moel is a holy job. He can't be Machal Shabbat. And Rab Obadyá tells us that the Moel thought that it's permissible because he's going to do a mitzvah. Therefore, it's permissible for him to ride in a car on Shabbat. So what to do? Chacham Ovadyah, again, this is just an example of the ignorance and what he's fighting against there. And he rules that since the people, they expect him to be the Moel and they know him, he said that you can rely on him as a Moel because he's not a complete Mechalel Shabbat. He thinks this is permissible. It's not that he's rejecting Shabbat. He's wrong, but he thinks it's permissible to ride in a car. However, for the religious Jews, for the ones who are his followers, he said you have to bring in this Moel from Alexandria, who was a real Shomer Shabbat. But most people weren't going to bring in a Moel from Alexandria, so it was either this Moel or they're not going to do anything. Later, Rab Obadyá tells us that he was able to convince the Moel not to drive the car himself. At least have a non-Jew drive you. That's also not permissible, but it's better than you driving yourself. So after his resignation in 1949, Chacham Ovadyá remains in Cairo. He still has his followers there. He gives shiurim. There were people who wanted to rehire him, but to no avail. They said, we'll rehire you if you give up your demand to make the hospital kosher. He refuses. Eventually, they would make the hospital kosher, but Rab Ovadyá, his resignation still stood. The leaders of the community were particularly angry at Chacham Ovadyá. The president of the community, actually, talk about chutzpah. The president of the community used Chacham Ovadyá's position about the Dayanim having to see the woman in the mikvah to talk about how Chacham Ovadyá Yosef had no tzniut, that he was advancing a sexually immoral practice that the Dayanim have to look in. Can you imagine that that's what the president of the community said? There were other issues Chacham Ovadyá had to deal with. So, for instance, in Cairo, you had Jewish schools. Not religious, but Jewish schools. Just to show you how not religious they were, first of all, on the boards of these Jewish schools, you had Karaites. There was a whole Karaite community in Cairo. And Chacham Ovadyá was very liberal when it came to the Karaites. The Ashkenazim do not allow Karaites to convert because they see the problems with the Yichus. Rab Obadyá not only permitted Karaites to convert in Egypt, in Eretz Israel, he also permitted Karaites to convert. But you can't have them as on board members before they convert. Second of all, these Jewish schools would schedule exams on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Who ever heard of a Jewish school scheduling exams on Shabbat and Yom Tov? But they did. So by 1950, Erev Rosh Hashanah, 1950, Rab Obadyá he understood already for a while that it was time to go home, and he leaves Egypt, goes home. However, his time there, first of all, he was able to influence a whole group, a whole generation almost, I shouldn't say generation, that implies more people, but a whole group of followers of his who made their way from Egypt, almost all of them to Israel, to be religious. I mean, they were growing up in an era where they came from traditional backgrounds, but there was, French culture was beckoning to them, Western culture was beckoning to them. And here Chacham Ovadyá comes on the scene, the only one. The other rabbis were pretty much useless to insist on proper observance of halacha, to give shiurim, to show that Judaism is something for the present, not just something for the past. I think it's even when he was in Egypt, Chacham Ovadyá, he had a great love of Arab music, in particular Kulthum. If you don't know who Kulthum is, you can Google her later. And I know people will say, well, what about Kol Isha, all that? It's not live performance. He never went to see her live, but he would listen to her music, liked it very much. And he had, having come from, Arabic speaking background, he really was the one who could pass on the tradition, not just to the Jews of Egypt, to the Jews in his time as well, in Eretz Yisrael as well. So we see, I think, the important thing. I titled this section "The Early Years." So let me just summarize quickly. You see a great Torah scholar. He doesn't come from the elites, comes from the people, able to achieve greatness. Already in his youth, he recognizes that the form of Torah study at Rab Obadyá Yosef is not a proper form of Torah study. You're never going to become a great Torah scholar with this form of Torah study. That shows his independence of thinking. He starts giving shiurim at age 18, also independent. Can you imagine 18 years old and you're telling people not to follow the Ben Yishchai? The bravery of a young man to go to leave Eretz Yisrael, to go to Egypt, to fight against community leaders. And after the war, he insisted on public identification that he comes from the land of Israel, preaching in Hebrew on occasion, despite the fact that that could be dangerous and be viewed as a Zionist, endeavor, that you could be thrown in jail for that, and everything that's going to come later. And it's a story of bravery. It's a story of a man of the people. We see this already in the youth. So with that, I will say, Chacham Ovadyá, the early years, if you look at his Teshuvot, the Yabia Omer in particular, you have a number of responsa. He already then had a very big library, a number of responsa from his days in Egypt. And he tells us these stories. He doesn't mention people's names. But if you're from the Egyptian community, you know who this evil shochet is, and you know who this phony chief rabbi is, and all these things. So it is a fascinating story. But when he comes back to Israel in 1950, no one would have dreamed that, you never would dream about this, that 50 years later, he's the greatest Torah scholar in the world, that sort of thing. He's a Torah scholar, an interesting person, but it's going to be the next stage of his life that you really see an incredible jump, not just in his standing, in his prestige, in his Torah influence. So, but I think it's important because everyone knows about his later significance and what he achieved, but the early years. So let me take questions and if there's some comments here. I know for many of you, the early years are not as interesting as the middle years or the later years. The middle years in particular are really the most interesting, but I don't think you can understand a person in their complete maturity without seeing where they come from. So the first one from Ibn Sefarad, I don't think is addressed to me, but Isaac asks, were his complaints valid in a sense that the others who attended said that Rab Obadyá Yosef wasn't good? Listen, most people who attend a yeshiva, you're loyal to it. So you really can't see the larger picture. So the people attending it and the rabbis there, their attitude was, this is our approach. But Chacham Ovadyá, even though he was there, that shows his independence. He could see that it's a problem, that they're not training great Torah scholars there. You can't be a great Torah scholar. In 6 months, he says, I think he said they did 14 pages or something. You can't become a great Torah scholar if that's what you cover. You spend a whole year and you cover 30 daf in Talmud? No. Chacham Ovadyá says you need to have iyun. Yes, you need to have iyun, which is examination, which they did very carefully at Rab Obadyá Yosef. But you also need bikiyut. You also need to cover ground, page after page. And Rab Obadyá Yosef, he could finish Shas in a year. That's how fast he was. You need both of them. Okay, so if anyone has any final questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. The next time we meet, then it really starts getting interesting, because then it's the middle years. Middle years are from 1950, how his rising in the Beit Din, his appointing to various positions, and really becoming the outstanding halachic figure he is, and of course the great dispute with the Iraqi community. You probably know the name, many of you, Reb Mordechai Eliyahu. They were very good friends, but it would not remain because Mordechai who's going to be the advocate of the Iraqi perspective, the Ben Ish Chai, and Chacham Ovadyah is going to explain why today we can't accept that. Now, Isaac says, where did scholars like Chacham Uziel come from? Well, Rav Uziel, he comes from real Sephardic background, and he was actually, they became chief rabbi in Salonika, and they're very different than Chacham Ovadyá Yosef, because he's Rav Uziel was, I don't know if you ever heard this expression, like a Sephardic gentleman. Rav Ben Sion Uziel, I mean, he's first of all, he comes from the background of rabbinic. His grandfather was, I don't think he was not Rishon LeZion, but he was Av Beitin, and he spoke French, and later and Ladino, and very moderate, liberal person. But Torah scholar, you would learn Torah scholar in Jerusalem. You learn Torah studies in Jerusalem. And he's not a Porat Yosef graduate. Well, I don't want to say it's a failure of the yeshiva. It's not a failure in the sense that they graduate numerous people. Many people studied there. And the chief rabbis, the Rishon LeZion, was always the head. That is the official Nasi. Chacham Bashi, they used to call it, was the official Nasi of the Porat Yosef Yeshiva. But what Chacham Ovadyah says is that their method of Torah study is not going to create Gedolei Torah, great Torah scholars. And if you become a great Torah scholar there, it's despite what they're teaching you. He thought it was a problem with their method. Now, as far as I know, Chacham Uziel never opened up a yeshiva. People would come study with him, but and he had students. Rav Chaim David Halevi, by the way, was one of his students, but he was not a Rosh Yeshiva. He was. I mean, I shouldn't say that. He had a yeshiva. I take that back. He had a yeshiva, Shar Tzion, but it was not a major yeshiva, and I don't know if he had much to do with it. He was chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and then he was chief rabbi of Rishon LeZion, chief rabbi of Israel. So I don't know. I can't speak that much about Chacham Uziel in that respect. I will tell you that Chacham Uziel was a very liberal halachic figure. He's always quoted, though, with the greatest respect by Chacham Ovadyah, even when he disagrees. Chacham Ovadyah, it's the next chief rabbi, Rav Nissim, the Iraqi, that there's going to be problems with. I don't know. I'll just end with this, since you mentioned Chacham Uziel. Chacham Uziel, just to give you an example, was a liberal approach. You see this in many ways, but on conversion. Chacham Uziel had the most liberal approach to conversion as you can imagine. Rav Ovadyah said that they need to accept Torah and mitzvot, but we don't check too much, and that's enough. Rav Uziel held that anyone who converts, even if they are not religious at all, even afterwards, as long as they go through the motions and they accept, they tell the Beit Din that they accept it, it's a valid conversion. And we say Devarim Shebalev Einam Devarim. If while they say I accept to fulfill mitzvot, they don't intend to, doesn't matter. That is, they accept to be Jewish, understanding they'll be a sinning Jew. And we have a lot of sinning Jews. Most Jews are sinning Jews. So if you can have a sinning Jew, Rav Uziel said you have a sinning convert. And that really was how in the state of Israel, if you ask yourself, because you study Torah, you're told that you can't become a convert unless you accept to be religious. And if you're not religious, today they void the conversion. And yet, if you know your history, you know that in the state of Israel in particular, you had many people who converted and they're not religious. How was that possible? It's possible because the position, the way they followed years ago was Rav Uziel's position. That as long as the people accept to follow the Torah, even if they don't follow it, we regard them as sinning Jews. That's all, according to Rav Uziel, that's all the Rambam requires. To say that you accept it and to recognize that if you violate the mitzvot, then you'll be called to account and you'll, whatever Onesh Hashem will give you, he'll give you. But the fact that you don't observe in practice is not enough. And this is, by the way, how it was practiced, not just in Rav Uziel. You had this in other places as well. I'm sure in Mexico, If you go back, you'll see lots of people were converted, and you look at them and you say, they're not so observant. How were they converted? Because that was a practice. Rab Uziel even had a Talmud. He became the Rav Avram Shalem, I think was his name, was a rabbi in Peru, and he had other Talmidim who went around the Sephardic world. So where they went, they followed Rab Uziel's position in this matter. But that's for another class, Rab Uziel. Okay, so if there's nothing else.
I have another question.
Yeah.
You said that Rabbi Obadyá was in contact with Rab Uziel. Wasn't he influenced by the way of thinking of Rab Uziel of studying scientific things?
It's a good question. And Rab Uziel also was a big Zionist. No, the only connection that Chacham Ovadyá had was halacha. Chacham Ovadyá was only halacha. Rab Uziel wrote the Rashot. He spoke about what's going on in the world and how it affects Judaism. He was a real intellectual thinker. Chacham Ovadyá Yosef is not an intellectual thinker. He's a posek. He's a darshan, but he's not going to give you an intellectual outlook like Rab Uziel. Rabbi Marc Angel has a whole book about Rab Uziel. Chacham Ovadyá Yosef is a posek. So his relationship to Rab Uziel is matters of halacha. That's basically Rav Ovadyah's whole life was Shas, Talmud, and poskim and halacha. That's what he was. Rav Uziel, you should have classes on Rav Uziel because Rav Uziel is so broad and so fascinating, and he's a model, very different model than Chacham Ovadyá Yosef, a model of a very broad Sephardic, not just posek, but thinker and community leader. By the way, before I go, are most of the people in your community from the Aleppo community or no?
Aleppo and Damascus.
Damascus, but there's also a Turkish community as well, right?
Not a Turkish, but a Sephardic community, and there's also a Turkish community, and they're also part of even Sepharad. I don't know if you know Rab Moichi Kurel. He's the chief rabbi of the Turkish community here in Mexico.
No, him I don't know. I was there once, but I was in your community. Yes. Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming out, and we'll meet one more time where we'll pick up the story. Yes. Okay. Good night, everyone.